Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 1. The topic for our discussion today is the approach that we call neoliberalism. But in order to understand what is neoliberalism, it is in the fitness of things that we understand what liberalism is all about. Liberalism as a philosophy was born in the womb of a feudal society that was gradually fading away in England. There are two concrete phenomena in social life: individual liberty and authority. And these two concepts are inversely proportional. That means if we want more liberty, authority must decline, and if authority increases, obviously that will entail a curtailment of liberty. The liberals were the predecessors of the capitalists, and they wanted a society in which there would be minimal control or restraints on their profit-making activities. Liberal theory of any kind revolves around the principle that governmental authority needs to be defined and curtailed, because the moment authority of the government is defined, it means that the space for individual freedom is secure. The power holders are apt to exercise their power arbitrarily, which in turn can lead to oppression, and so the best way to prevent an abuse of power is to define it. The limitation of governmental power ensures the liberties of the people. But who are these people? Who are these liberals who wanted freedom in the first place? The idea of liberalism was historically connected with the rise of the commercial and industrial middle classes in Europe, particularly England. And the needs of these classes exercised immense influence in the making of the liberal principles. Since its purposes were shaped by the owners of property, the margins between its claims and its performance have always been wide. In theory, liberalism stood for the freedom of all, but in practice, the equality which it preached is to be understood in a subjective mood, in the sense that liberalism told virtually even the lame and the blind, the sick and the poor, that if they too could become men of ability, they would be able to take advantages of the opportunities unleashed by a liberal state. But it lacked the imaginative insight to realize that the class relationship it had built made this quite an impossible adventure. Its enclosures separated peasant from the land. Its rule of commercial ownership left the industrial worker with nothing but his labor to sell. The goal of early liberalism was therefore not really to liberate all men, but only the propertied classes from the authoritarian restraints imposed by the state, the church, and by traditions. The theory viewed man as an infinite consumer and desirer of utilities. So obviously you can understand that society was held to be the best if you could offer the individual with the widest possible freedom of choice. Such a theory portrayed a good society as one which maximized human satisfaction, and the liberal society facilitated the maximization of the aggregate satisfaction because it instituted the widest possible choice, and it was claimed that this maximization was achieved in an equitable manner. So what kind of a state did the early liberals desire? The liberal tradition had been built in a market society whose ethos was competitive maximization of individual utilities. In this contractual society, the nexus between master and man was purely a cash nexus. Everyone was swept into the free market, and all his relations were increasingly converted into market relations. The market society also indicated a shift from ascription, which is the hallmark of a feudal society, to achievement, which is the hallmark of a market or a capitalist society. The early liberals wanted a state which they could control as per their own will, and there would be least interference of the state by way of the monarch in their financial activities. They wanted a state in which there would exist religious liberty, freedom of thought, expression, faith, belief, and This was important to them because these liberals earlier in the womb of the feudal society had to suffer persecution for their non-conformity with the ethical ideals of the established church. They wanted to limit the privileges of a landed aristocracy, which tended to secure a monopoly of political office. With this view of the state in mind, they definitely wanted to change the state structure. The ethical basis of early liberalism was provided by the Puritan ethics. The new ethos of the acquisitive market society was ethically championed by the Puritan ethics, which was a response to the economic interests of the rising bourgeoisie. If you remember, when the Roman Catholic Church held its sway over medieval Europe, individuals were expected to conform to the teachings and the preachings of the church, which wanted to inculcate in all the principle of social or collective responsibility. And that is why the story of the noble Samaritan was much eulogized, because it was said that men are brothers and sisters in society, and God would be happy with them only if they were caring and concerned about others. And that alone, this kind of social responsibility, this kind of social concern alone would fetch them a ticket to heaven. But the liberals, or the first generation capitalists, wanted a society in which there would be no restraints on their profit-making activities. But how could people be motivated to work and to indulge in commercially rewarding work if they were only thinking about ways to attain heavenly salvation? So it was necessary, it was imperative to create some kind of a work culture, and this is where Puritanism came in handy, because Puritanism sought to tell everybody that God was keeping an individual watch over all of us. So that is how individual responsibility becomes of paramount importance. And if God did not want us to be industrious and hardworking, He would not have showered us with so much of natural wealth and resources. And this individual responsibility was what was ushered in by the Puritan ethics. What were the problems with the liberal state? You see, the task of the liberal state was therefore to protect and enforce the mechanism of free contract and to ensure each the right to such property as he could acquire by his own labor and by his contracts. The state, under the circumstances, was assigned a limited role, a role that did not require from it any positive or affirmative action. Despite possessing an attractive facade, liberal theory of the state, however, came in for criticisms on various grounds. First, it was claimed that the market system maximizes aggregate satisfaction of the aggregate population in a rather subjective way, and it cannot be compared on a single yardstick. Secondly, the claim that the market maximizes utilities equitably also ran into greater difficulties. Equity in the liberal tradition meant the distribution of values of resources in proportion to the contributions made by each individual to the aggregate product in a particular society. The distribution was never carried out on the basis of individual or felt needs. But the perfect competition which liberal thinkers assumed was a myth, and the concept of equity in such conditions of imperfect competition was therefore unacceptable. So what was the glaring defect of the liberal state? You see, liberal state seemed to have hardened its heart against the poor by assuming that everyone in society began the race from the same point. That was far from the truth. Not only is there incidental inequality, there is also natural inequality. As a result of this entrenched inequality in society, people do not really run the race from the same point. The mistake on part of liberalism was that it treated unequals equally by subjecting them to similar conditions of freedom in the name of equality. As a result, inequality got accentuated. Therefore, there was need for modification of the liberal state. In view of the major drawback of the liberal society, liberal theory was in need of some kind of a revision. This modification was necessary because there was a rising demand on part of the deprived sections of the people who had thought that liberalism would offer them freedom, and that in turn would act like a magical wand and allow them to transform their lives for the better. That was not to be. Because you see, please remember that even in these times, people accepted that some were much better off than others, and that is a reality which they found difficult to grapple with. They thought that the only panacea for their degraded plight lay in voting rights. Do recall that voting rights were at that point of time based on property considerations. So if people were men of property, they were allowed to vote, and if they were not granted the right. But the tragedy lay in the fact that these common people thought that they were not well off because they had no voting rights. It was quite the other way. They did not have voting rights simply because they were not men of property. And that is why they thought that if franchise was extended to the masses, they would also become men of affluence. So why was liberal theory democratized? In the context of the rising demand of the working majority for grant of franchise, the capitalist class felt that it was time to grant this concession to the working classes, more so because there was a lurking fear of a socialist revolution, and that was something which had to be dealt with. Under the circumstances, liberal theory had to be democratized, so liberal democratic theory was liberal first and democratic later. But you see, despite the incorporation of this democratic facade, the essential character of liberal theory was not altered. Liberal democratic theory remained at heart liberal theory, and therefore guilty of all the pitfalls that we hold true with regard to liberal theory. Liberal democratic theory, despite its tall claims, was liberal theory essentially. Although economically liberal democratic theory styles itself as a welfare state, undertaking to cater to the basic needs of those who cannot contribute to the wealth of the society, the resources of the state is able to pump into such welfare activities is invariably less than what is drawn out of the majority of the population. The liberal democratic theory, liberal first and democratic later, continues to remain, in a sense, a theory which is committed to the justification of the ethos of free enterprise that is embodied by capitalism. So, we have seen that liberalism or liberal theory metamorphosed into liberal democratic theory, but the incorporation of the democratic element was just a facade which did not really alter the essential character of liberal theory, which is a theory that hardens its heart against the poor by considering that the lame, the sick, the poor, and the blind are men who have failed in life because of their own inadequacies. It refuses to accept that the class structure which thrives in society is something which liberal theory promotes and accentuates. Liberalism, in a sense, is the ideology of the industrialized West. So deeply have the liberal ideas permeated political, economic, and cultural life that their influence can become hard to discern, liberalism appearing to be indistinguishable from Western civilization in general. So liberalism becomes almost synonymous with the West. Liberal thinkers in the 18th and the 19th century, influenced by an Enlightenment belief in universal reason, tended to subscribe to an explicitly foundationist form of liberalism which sought to establish fundamental values and championed a particular vision of human flourishing of excellence, usually linked to personal autonomy. That is why the individual remains the focal point of liberal theory. This form of liberalism was also boldly universalistic in that it implied that human history would be marked by the gradual but inevitable triumph of liberal principles and institutions. Progress, in short, was understood strictly in liberal terms. Liberalism has a morally neutral stance in the sense that during the 20th century, it became fashionable to portray liberalism as morally neutral. This is reflected in the belief that liberalism gives priority to the right over the good. In other words, liberalism strives to establish the conditions in which people and groups can pursue the good life as each defines it. But it does not prescribe or try to promote any particular notion or dogma about what must be good. From this perspective, liberalism is not simply an ideology, but a meta-ideology, that is, a body of rules that lays down the grounds upon which political and ideological debate can take place. So what are the 10 central themes of the philosophy of liberalism that has emerged from the Western world? Liberalism is not simply a philosophy of do your own thing. While liberalism undoubtedly favors openness, debate, and self-determination, it is also characterized by a powerful moral thrust. The moral and ideological stance of liberalism is embodied in a commitment to a distinctive set of values and beliefs which are emphatic about the importance, first of all, of the individual. I just shared with you the conviction of liberalism that if the individual ceases to count, what is left of society? And that is why the individual remains the fulcrum of liberalism. Related to the belief in the individual or the centrality of the individual is the belief in freedom, understood essentially as absence of restraint. And we have already seen this when we discovered the story of the rise of liberalism, to what extent the rising commercial classes were desirous of the absence of restraints upon their profit-making activities. The third important aspect is a belief in reason or the rationality of man. So every man is in a position to understand what he must aspire for and what is important to him, what his priorities are. And that belief in reason is also linked with a desire that every man therefore should be given his due, in the sense that every individual should be respected and given the kind of opportunity that he is desirous of. And this is where reason gives way to the notion of justice, that is fairness. That it is only fair that everyone should be given the opportunity, the freedom, and the space to develop his life according to his priorities and to realize himself. And that leads us to the final important aspect of the liberal creed, and that is belief in toleration and diversity. That everyone has a right to decide for himself the path that he or she would like to walk upon. And that means there could be 100 roads for 100 people, each trying to pursue his or her own dreams, and hence the importance of toleration and pluralism and diversity. But in all this, liberalism is covetous of a state that will interfere only minimally. Classical liberalism is often associated with the belief that the state ought to be minimal, which means that practically everything except armed forces, law enforcement, and other non-excludable goods ought to be left to the free dealings of the citizens and the organizations they freely choose to establish and take part in. This kind of state is sometimes described as a night watchman state, as the sole purpose of the minimal state is to uphold the most fundamental aspects of public order. The basic ethos of the liberal state is that the state exists because crime exists. Therefore, the task of the state is not to foster and promote, but to prevent and check. In that sense, the state is essentially a negative state, a limited state, a night watchman state, a minimal state, all of which are euphemistic expressions to try and suggest that the state will be restricted to a very definite set of activities and nothing beyond. Classical liberalism has thus much common ground with what we have described as economic liberalism. And it is often the case that classical liberalism, with its tendency to favor laissez-faire, which is basically leave alone, leave every individual alone, economic policies portrayed as leading proponents of neoliberalism. But modern liberalism reconciles itself to an important role of the state in the economy. Let us see what that role is. Modern liberalism is characterized by a greater willingness to let the state become an active participant in the economy. This has often issued in a pronounced tendency to regulate the marketplace and to have the state supply essential goods and services to everyone. Modern liberalism, therefore, for all intents and purposes, is a profound revision of liberalism, especially of the economic policies traditionally associated with it. Whereas classical or economic liberals favor laissez-faire economic policies because it is thought that they lead to more freedom and real democracy, modern liberals tend to claim this analysis is inadequate and misleading, and that the state must play a significant role in the economy if the most basic liberal goals and purposes are to be made into reality. So how can we define neoliberalism? I would like to harp on the definition posited by Harvey. Neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework. Mark the words institutional framework, please, because this is what we will find as the embodiment of the state. It is a state which maintains and provides this framework, and this is characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and to preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, for example, the quality and integrity of money. It must also set up those military, defense, police, and legal structures and functions required to secure private property rights and to guarantee by force, if need be, the proper functioning of the markets. So the state is a facilitator of liberalism. Furthermore, if markets do not exist in such areas as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, or even environmental pollution, then they must be created by the state action if necessary. But beyond the tasks that we have just mentioned, the state should not venture. And that is why I reiterate that the state functions more as a facilitator of liberalism. State interventions in markets, once they have been created, must be kept to a bare minimum because, according to the theory, the state cannot possibly possess enough information to second-guess market signals or prices, and because powerful interest groups will invariably distort and bias state interventions, particularly in democracies, to suit their own interests and benefits. This reflects the firmly held belief that the world has experienced an emphatic turn towards neoliberalism in political economic practices and thinking since the 1970s. This is exactly what we mean by the retreat of the state. But this retreat of the state does not in any way suggest disappearance. The state will be there, but in a very limited capacity as a facilitator of liberalism. Harvey proposes with this definition to view neoliberalism not as the rejuvenation of liberalism in general, but as a distinctive economic theory which in recent times has replaced a more mild-mannered embedded liberalism. And that is why we realize that neoliberalism has often found expression in Reaganism and Thatcherism. It is apparent that Harvey sees neoliberalism not as a continuation of liberalism proper, but something which lives independently of mainstream liberal values and policies. In fact, it seems that some neoliberals are not liberals in any meaningful sense at all, as Harvey seats anti-liberal Democrats such as Deng Xiaoping and Augusto Pinochet among the political vanguard of neoliberalism. Nevertheless, there seems to be neoliberals with a liberal identity as well. And among these political theorists and economists, such as Hayek and Friedman, figure prominently alongside nominally conservative politicians such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who, in Harvey's view of our recent history, are being largely responsible for all things that are being christened as neoliberal. So neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices rather than a complete political ideology. Harvey's definition has tried to clarify that everything from Thatcherism to socialism with Chinese characteristics belong to the domain of neoliberalism. Harvey emphasizes, therefore, and rightly so, that neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices rather than a complete political ideology. In fact, it does not seem to be of any sort of clear-cut connection or even a correlation between a favorable assessment of neoliberal economic practices and a commitment to liberalism proper. Liberalism, we saw, transformed itself into liberal democratic theory, and liberal democratic theory gradually metamorphosed into a concept of a welfare state where there was affirmative action on part of the state. But I think that role has undergone some kind of a redefinition at the hands of the neoliberals, prominently brought out in the policies of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the like, who have tried to clearly suggest that the state must be a facilitator of liberal practices which are important for individuals to prosper. So could neoliberal ideas apply to the international level as well? That is an intriguing question. Neoliberalism, as we see it, loosely demarcated set of political beliefs which most prominently and prototypically include the conviction that the only legitimate purpose of the state is to safeguard individual, especially commercial liberty, as well as strong private property rights. This conviction usually issues in turn in a belief that the state ought to be a minimal state, or at least drastically reduced in strength and size, and that any transgression by the state beyond its acceptable and legitimate purpose is just not right. These beliefs could apply to the international level as well, where a system of free markets and free trade ought to be implemented as well. The only acceptable reason for regulating international trade is to safeguard the same kind of commercial liberty and same kinds of strong property rights which ought to be realized on a national level. Neoliberalism generally also includes the belief that freely adopted market mechanisms is the optimal way of organizing all exchanges of goods and services. Free markets and free trade will, so it is believed by the exponents of neoliberalism, set free the creative potential and the entrepreneurial spirit which is built into the spontaneous order of a liberal society. So liberal society has always been marked by a desire to facilitate the individuals to flourish and to live their lives the way they aspire. And that is why it is important that liberalism recognizes both at the national and at the international level that the individual is best left free to himself. And that can be ensured by a state which chooses to interfere the least. So only the state can serve as a facilitator of liberal practices by not encroaching upon the space where individuals are free to act and give shape to their lives as per their aspirations. So neoliberalism does have a perspective on moral virtue, and we would like to clarify that. Neoliberalism could also include a perspective on moral virtue. The good and the virtuous person is one who is able to access the relevant markets and function as a competent actor in these markets. He or she is willing to accept the risks associated with participating in free markets and to adapt to rapid changes arising from such participation. Individuals are also seen as being solely responsible for the consequences of the choices and the decisions they freely make. Instances of inequality and glaring social injustices are morally acceptable. You see, liberalism is all about accepting the rules of the game. So if the participants have prepared to play the game and agreed to play the game as per the terms to which they have all agreed, then the outcome should be acceptable to all, even if they are not as fortunate as the others. If a person demands that the state should regulate the market or make reparations to the unfortunate who has been caught at the losing end of a freely initiated market transaction, this is viewed as an indication that the person in question is morally depraved and underdeveloped, and scarcely different from a proponent of a totalitarian state. And that is why I said that liberalism believes that every individual has agreed to play the game as per rules on which there is a consensus. And once they have agreed to play the game as per rules on which a consensus has been established, the outcome should also be embraced and accepted by all, even if things may not be rosy for each and every participant. We can therefore conclude that neoliberals claim, in effect, that as much as possible, decision making ought to be left to the market or other processes which individuals freely choose to participate in, and consequently, as little as possible to be subjected to genuinely political processes. And that is why we harp on the notion that the state is a minimal state. Proponents of neoliberalism are therefore often, in the critical literature, portrayed as skeptics of democracy. If the democratic process slows down neoliberal reforms or threatens individual and commercial liberty, which is the sine qua non of neoliberalism, which it sometimes does, then democracy ought to be sidestepped and replaced by the rule of experts or legal instruments designed for that purpose. Therefore, we clearly see a shift in case of neoliberalism if we contrast it with classical or early liberalism. The practical implementation of neoliberal policies will therefore lead to that is what I meant by the shift, to a relocation of power from political to economic processes, from the state to the markets and individuals, and finally, from the legislatives and the executive authorities to the judiciary. These shifts are the central thrusts which we need to harp on while looking at the basic or fundamental attributes of neoliberalism. Thank you.